What is a reasonable population that the Earth can sustain without maximizing the pressure on these systems that we need for survival? So that's what I mean by we've got it backwards. Instead of chasing population, we should be asking ourselves, what's a reasonable population for the world so that we can develop systems that can meet that demand?
Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Jay Weeks, PhD candidate in the Department of Agronomy. My co-host is Scott Zanona, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of science.
Sometimes, with large, complicated endeavors, we need to take a step back and ask whether our current approaches and underlying assumptions are truly serving our end goals. Given our ever-globalizing food system, it's important to take inventory of what we've learned and consider where things could be improved or go horribly, horribly wrong. Our guest today is Dr. Jim Stack. Jim is a professor of plant pathology here at Kansas State University and the director of the Great Plains Plant Diagnostic Network. His areas of research emphasis include detection and diagnosis of diseases in natural and agricultural plant systems, threat identification, vulnerability assessments, and risk analysis for natural, accidental, and intentional threats to plant systems, as well as epidemiology and management of field crop diseases in the northern Great Plains. But as you will hear, he is a great thinker about the food system in general. Our conversation largely centers around the more quote-unquote wicked problems that humans face, and we definitely don't have all the solutions, but this was a really great and constructive discussion to have. Only by talking through ideas are we going to make progress. Dr. Maureen Olewnik, the Global Food Systems Initiative Coordinator, joined Scott, Jim, and I for the talk as well, so we hope you enjoy. Dr. Jim Stack, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Been looking forward to this for a few weeks now, but before we get into the discussion that I hope all four of us are going to get to have, we always like to get your perspective on your background. So will you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be where you are today?
How did I get to be where good fortune. I mean, I've been pretty blessed to have a series of great jobs throughout my career. Interest stemmed from probably having an Irish heritage. My folks are from Ireland, so the topic of the day being hunger, and there's a lot of ties to Ireland. I tell the story often, how bright my family is. They stayed in Ireland for the famine and came over to the U.S. for the Great Depression.
Good timing.
Yeah, timing is right, yeah. But I think during the years when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I always been a news junkie. So at the time, we were talking about famines in Ethiopia, we were talking about famines in Bangladesh, we were talking about famines in Biafra. These were headlines, these were pictures on the evening news. So I think that leaves an impression on people when you see at some place in the world there's a true shortage of food, either through war, through production failures, through climate impacts. So these are real. We don't see that much in the United States, certainly not to that level, but these are very real events that happen up to this day. The World Food Program, World Bank, we're projecting that in Yemen, Ethiopia, Southern Sudan, that there would be approximately 1 million deaths to food inadequacies over this 2 or 3 year period we're in right now. So this is a complex issue that we have not solved yet. And so I think that had a major bearing on the direction I took.
So when, before we ever started the podcast, we always like to ask the guests what they would like to talk about and sort of get a map for the conversation a little bit ahead of time. And when I asked you, you said, my interests are in food security and they're broad ranging from policy to production and distribution. You said, as you know, there are many scientific issues embedded within the food security challenge, but equally important are the policy and philosophical considerations. For all the science that is dedicated to addressing food security, perhaps we have not done enough thinking. So, what was behind that response? And given all these issues and things like that, well, what do you think?
Well, so I'm guessing the podcast has a finite period of time to answer that question within, but I think people have called this a wicked problem, meaning that it's complex to the extent where one issue impacts the other. And this is clearly in that realm, this food security issue. But we automatically make assumptions about the solutions. Well, if there isn't enough food, it means we need to produce more. If there isn't enough food, it means we need to ship it from this location to that location. And I would argue that thinking will ultimately exacerbate this problem, not solve it. And so that's what's behind that statement I made. I think more thinking needs to go into this. So I don't know how to jump into this, but say perhaps our thinking's backwards. Is the way I like to explain it, that we keep saying that the population is going to be this level. So we've been doing this for decades. Say the population is going to be 4 billion. It's going to be 5 billion. It's going to be 6 billion. It's going to be 7 billion. And in order to feed 6, 7 billion people, we need to produce more food, and we need to create the systems that get food to people who need food. So production and distribution. And that for those times when there is a natural disaster, famine, drought, whatever the natural catastrophe might be, that we need to be able to move food to those people. So it's always about feeding the next population target. And right now we're saying, and the population models are pretty good. They've been very accurate over the last 20 to 30 years. So looking ahead, we have no reason to doubt that they're not too far off the mark. So we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet by 2043, quite likely to have 10 billion somewhere between 2055 and 2060. And now they're saying that that's not going to plateau, that we may in fact have 11 billion people by the end of the century. And so what? We need to produce more food, and we need better distribution systems, and we need better food aid systems so that we can produce more and get it to the people who need it. Well, let's take that apart and say, well, what does that actually mean? Well, let's look at the challenges we have right now, which are many. Some of them are significant. The climate issue is real. The climate is changing. There's ample data to support that. And that will have an impact on our ability to produce food. I would argue, there are many issues in the food security. One of the most important is water, and that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. Approximately 70%, somewhere between 65 and 75% of the fresh water on the planet goes to agriculture. The last figures I saw were only about 25% of the agricultural lands are irrigated, but they provide 40% of our food. So there's no scenario under which we're going to feed the world's population without irrigated agriculture. That's off the table. And so we need to figure out a way, if we're going to amp up our production systems, it's going to require more water. Where's that coming from? At the same time, if we look at the original Millennium Development Goals of 1999 and now the Sustainable Development Goals of just a few years ago, if we look at those, what are they calling for? Well, they're calling for food security. No one should be food insecure. No one on the planet. Okay, so we're talking about 9 billion people are going to be completely food secure. We're talking about enhancing public health to the level where people don't suffer from the chronic diseases that are plaguing us right now, as well as emerging infectious diseases, which have sudden and real impacts. And we're talking about raising standards of living. So if we do all of those things, that means more energy, it means more water. And these are the very things that are challenging us in order to meet our food demands. So if we look at it from the perspective where we're always going to ramp up our systems to meet the advancing population, we never solve the problem because the population will increase until it crashes. What I'm suggesting is we turn that around, that we learn from the biological systems that we study. And we know without exception, at least exception that I'm aware of, we know without exception, biological organisms stabilize according to the available nutrient. So I can predict how many bacterial cells there will be in a culture by the amount of carbon and nitrogen I put into that culture. I can predict predator and prey populations based on the relationships that have been long identified. And that, again, almost without exception, the exceptions come in when you have an introduced infectious disease or some other major climatic perturbation. But, in general, predator-prey populations follow certain behavioral patterns that we've been able to predict. Right now, we actually calculate how many cattle per hectare based on the productivity of the hectare. So the decomposition of the pasture grasses or whatever the plant composition is, we can actually predict how many cattle or sheep that hectare can sustain. We have formulas for that. So my question is, why can't we do that for humans? Why can't we actually determine what is a reasonable population that the earth can sustain without maximizing the pressure on these systems that we need for survival? So that's what I mean by we've got it backwards. Instead of chasing population, we should be asking ourselves, what's a reasonable population for the world so that we can develop systems that can meet that demand? And it doesn't mean withholding food from people who are hungry. It does not mean that.
I was going to say, this has got to be highly controversial, right?
Of course it will,
Sure.
because that's our immediate thought, is that it means withholding food. It does not mean that at all. It means basing the calculations on the productivity, the reasonable productivity of those systems, and letting our population stabilize around that mean. Yes, it means changing our thinking. But what's the alternative? The alternative is to accept the unspoken assumption that everything else is limitless. Now, is that a reasonable assumption, I ask you? Are all these systems without limits? If they are, all's good, let's go.
Okay, so I've got a lot of questions, but I want to jump in first with a comparison to like mid-late 20th century, right, where 1970s where people are worried about the population explosion, say there's no way the planet can sustain, 6 billion people, right? And then we have the Green Revolution, right? Sort of things change. And in fact, we have technological solutions to actually ramp up productions in ways that people hadn't foreseen. So how do you compare that to the current situation?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I haven't always thought the way I do now. It's been an evolution, but I've been working on this issue for probably about 20 years in terms of my thinking. And so how this is different, one of the people you referenced was Paul Ehrlich from Stanford. He used to have a title, I think it's one of his books, Population Bomb.
Right.
So the implication being that the world's population is going to increase to a point and then there'll be a major crash. I don't see that at all. I don't see anything that's going to cause that. So what I'm talking about is constantly doing the same thing over and over again and not achieving the goal. So our goal is food security for everybody. It's public health for everybody. It's a reasonable standard of living for everybody. That's what I'm talking about. And if we always look ahead to what the population is going to be and keep ramping up, knowing that what we've been doing for the last 50 years hasn't achieved the goal, perhaps we need to think about that a little bit differently. So what I'm suggesting is developing systems, developing the technologies, doing the science necessary to get to a point where the vast majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people, are in fact food secure. We don't have abject poverty. Will we have income inequality? Always. But not to the point where people are starving or people are dying because they lack access to the medicines and the health care they need. I think we can do that part. So when I look at this hunger challenge, the title of one of the manuscripts I'm developing is Feeding a Growing Population in a Shrinking World. Well, that question really comes down to three types of questions. The first one is, can we feed 9 billion, 10 billion, 11 billion? Yes, I think we can. We can do the science and we can develop the technologies necessary to feed an increasing population. But I think the outcome's the same, where we always have starving people. We always have people that need health care because of the way we're approaching the problems. So I just look at it in that respect. So the first question is, can we? Yes, we can do the science. We can develop the technologies necessary. We're already doing that. Amazing developments are going on. The world is populated with a lot of very bright people. So yes, we can do the science to get to where we want to be. The second type of question is, will we? Will we feed 9, 10, 11 billion people? Well, those are questions of policy. And our track record in policy is awful. It's just abysmal. And we haven't demonstrated an ability to learn from the failures in policy. And so I look at that and say, will we? I think yes, eventually, but not before a lot of people suffer unnecessarily because we didn't do what needed to be done in a time frame to affect the outcome in a meaningful way. So I think, that's the second question, will we? The third question is more difficult. It's the one we dealt with to start. And that question is, should we? So the first two questions are scientific in nature. You can have a reasonable discussion and maintain it being intellectual in nature. But that third one, it's more philosophical, and so it quickly transitions into emotion. And it's very difficult to have that conversation. And again, I reiterate, the goal is actually the same. It's to ensure that we don't have a disproportionate number of people without access to health care and food. That doesn't even make sense in today's world. We already have the technologies. We've already done the science necessary to feed our current population, yet hunger persists. We should be challenging ourselves on why that is.
Right, good. So then to be clear then, I think at least one difference, and there's a lot we're all, I'm sure, going to start jumping in on, but one of the differences here is I was reading some of what you were saying a little pessimistically to start with, right? Sort of, right? We're and it's pessimistic on some views, right, in terms of like sort of our policy and other things, but in terms of our ability to feed people, it's not pessimistic there, right? So what I was hearing for a moment was, we're not going to be able, there's limited resources, water, et cetera. We're not going to be able to feed all these people. We have to figure out how to limit the population. But what you just said wasn't that.
Absolutely
it was,
not.
Right? Yeah. So,
absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I'm an optimist by nature.
Yeah.
So we are going to solve these. The question is the time frame. So if I was a young person looking at a career, I'd be excited to jump into this arena because your career would be meaningful. You'd be solving some problems that have been intractable for as long as we've been walking upright. And so I think we have in place the educational systems that are necessary to generate the people that are going to solve these problems. All of that's going to play out. The question is, does it play out by 2050 or does it play out by 2150? And that's what I'm saying is if we can change our thinking now, we can shorten that time frame till we get to where we need to be. And I go back to what's our real thinking on limits? Are there any limits in this world? Is there a limit to fresh water? Well, no, we can desalinate the oceans. So no, we have a lot of water. Is there a limit to land area? Well, yes, kinda, but we keep ramping up yield per per hectare. So, what is that limit? I don't think people. Oh, it's actually a really good book. Charles Mann's the author. The Wizard and the Prophet. It's a very good book about that. And it's basically a profile of Norman Borlaug and just went blank. Another person that they kind of had a co-evolutionary pathway, but they looked at the world differently. One was a pessimist, one was an optimist, one was a technologist, one was a philosopher. They are social scientists, I should say, rather than philosopher. But they looked at the same situations from different perspectives and drew different conclusions. But it's an excellent read, and it deals with this: do we believe there are limits? And the problem I think we have is nobody's even asking that question in a meaningful way. We talk about sustainability, we talk about resilience, but those terms get tossed around so much now they actually don't have any meaning whatsoever because they're applied to everything. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. But
So a couple of things. The first being, a lot of people seem to think that as conditions improve, and especially women have access to education in the developing world and things like that, that the population in those areas actually starts to decrease, right? Families have fewer children and things like that. So the idea is sort of that, once we reach that 10 or 11 and the standard of living comes up, that it'll sort of plateau. I mean, that's the argument that I've heard. Second question is, if we all intellectually agree that, there's a carrying capacity and we need to, slow the population down and things like that. You mentioned the emotional part. If we start putting that out there and saying, maybe people should be having fewer children or something like that to slow population growth, how do you even start to approach that problem? Because it's so emotional and people want to have their own ability to make their own decisions, right?
Again, it's about how you frame this issue. The goal is not to control population. The goal is to create a system, an ecosystem, a planet Earth that is appropriate for a certain population level. So it's not focusing on the population, it's focusing on the systems that support people. And so you identified a few things which are right on the mark. We already know how to do this. When you increase public health, when you increase education, birth rates decline. So we already know how to do this. We're just not doing it very effectively. Sometimes it's very difficult. If you just look at what's going on in the Congo right now with the Ebola outbreak, you have rebel groups and you have populations that are attacking healthcare providers because they believe that the vaccine is going to cause AIDS. And so education is absolutely critical in this everywhere. So we already know how to do this. We've just focused on the wrong thing. We're focusing on food production. We're focusing on being able to supply enough to a future population without focusing on the needs of the current population to the level necessary to affect the trajectory. Now, people say, oh, well, if the population gets too big, a disease is going to come along, like avian influenza or something, and it's going to take out the population. I've run some numbers. We have some models we play with, run some numbers. Even if you go back to the Spanish influenza of 1918 and use those numbers, which vary somewhere between 30 and 100 million people dead globally, let's take
which as a percentage was really significant, right?
Yes, absolutely. But even if you take that number and you adjust it, it's not going to change the fact that if we continue to do what we're doing, at some point we're going to hit 10 or 11 billion people because nothing's changed. All it's done is it displaces the curve. But the curve still continues when that's resolved. And right now we have in place mitigation measures and response protocols that are going to minimize the number impacted. Well, what about war? Well, if you look at war, I mean, okay, this is going to sound really awful. Not enough people die from wars anymore. You know, you go back 100 years and we talked about millions dying in a world war. But war has become technology-oriented and strategic in nature. And so we spent a decade in Iraq and 4,000 people died. That's awful. But it didn't really impact the population. And that's what I think you look at. What are the major factors that could change that trajectory? They don't have the same level of impact anymore.
Right. So in other words, I mean, these things are just the population is going to keep on increasing, and even some things that slow down, even if we had a major disease, or right, sort of, it's not changing the trajectory that we're on. It's just pushing the date further down. Yeah.
Barring the zombie apocalypse. Yeah.
When you say that we need to think, we need to change the way we think. Who's the we, and how do you impact? How do you move that needle on the we?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We have national, we have international organizations that have accepted some responsibility for food security and for public health. I don't mean this to be too critical, but the nature of international organizations is it's difficult to actually do what needs to get done. So you only have to look at the Ebola outbreak of, was it 13 or 14, to see that it was clear to a lot of epidemiologists. I'm with a group now that predicted the trajectory of that back in March of that year. World Health Organization stepped in August. By that time, it was far too late to affect the outcome. And you look at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations and the World Food Program. They've rallied around the notion that to solve this food security problem, we need further intensification of agricultural production systems, and we need better global trade systems. We need to bring more developing nations into the global economy, the global marketplace. Well, there are consequences to that, and they're being realized right now. One of the consequences of intensification, of course, is more inputs to get more output, and there are implications for that. With respect to trade networks, we're already seeing the massive global mixing of pests and pathogens that are having major impacts on our ability to produce enough food. Just look what happened in Bangladesh in 2016. And that was a consequence of the global trade system of moving wheat, seed, grain from one location to another.
For the listeners that wouldn't know what that is, can you explain?
Oh, sorry. So in 1985, a new disease of wheat emerged in Brazil. And it stayed in Brazil for almost a decade, causing increasing impacts. Like a lot of diseases, very weather dependent. So when the weather conditions, and it's been linked to El Nino, when an El Nino comes in, you have epidemics. And this is a very impressive disease. So we've seen 500, 1,000 hectare fields all dead. So it's very quick. It's very impressive. In the mid-90s, 95 or so, it was introduced to Bolivia, probably trade, farmers bringing seed across the border. And then 1 or 2 years later into Paraguay, same route of entry. It stayed in South America until February of 2016 when there was a massive epidemic in Bangladesh. Now, wheat is the second most important provider of calories in Bangladesh, but they don't produce enough, so they historically imported from the Ukraine. Ukraine had a few political problems, unable to make that meet the demand for Bangladesh. Bangladesh went on the open marketplace. This is the suspicion. You can never fully prove these things. Wheat gets imported from South America, and the genomics and genetics have been done on this. It's clear that the outbreak in Bangladesh was the population that came from South America. That's very clear. And so it was trade introduced. Wheat is a very important crop. It's grown on more acres globally than any other crop. It provides 17% of the protein in the human diet. So this is a crop we have to protect but we have a system, a pathogen that moves in seed, and we have a global distribution system that's moving seed across the planet. That's just one example. That's happening in every commodity. It's happening. It's everywhere. That's the way we do business now. So again, you go and say, well, what should we be doing? Well, instead of focusing on prevention, which is overrated, we should be focusing on surveillance and early detection so we can hit these things when they're small and not wait until we have a flaming epidemic to respond. So there are a lot of things we can be doing better than we are doing currently, but it does take a change in thinking.
So what about the trade itself, right? And the general approach of increasing production in certain areas and then distribution, right? Sort of because there's concern about sort of the global network on a whole range of issues. It's not just sort of the possibilities of transfer of pests and pathogens, but also sort of further instability, like when prices change and you have to, get your food from other places rather than sort of local autonomy, right, or producing your food. And, this is my area, so I know there's a lot of questions that come up when we're talking about this model of increasing production in certain areas and delivering.
So it's a very complicated issue, as
sure.
you might imagine. I don't even know where to begin on this one, but let me begin here. A few years ago, a group published a paper recommending that we create global committees to regulate the production of food, so that if we do an analysis, we would determine that it's more environmentally friendly, it's more energy efficient to produce maize, corn in Iowa than it is in Kenya. So Kenya should not be allowed to produce corn. We should grow it in Iowa and ship it to Kenya. The same with water. We should be deciding that we should not be irrigating crops in western Kansas. That's dryland, rain-fed agriculture. So they should not be allowed to irrigate there. So they actually published a paper on this, and they believe that I can't think of a worse model for achieving sustainability than what they proposed.
Yeah, so say why.
Just say, what could possibly go wrong with that?
I mean, not to mention all the people who are going to be left behind in systems like that, right? I mean,
okay, it's a disaster in thinking. I just, at least that's my opinion.
Sure.
So you look at the trade issue. We're moving so many problems with this. I think our eagerness to bring some of these countries into the global marketplace superseded our thinking on what was necessary for them to do that safely. So we should have been simultaneously investing in their infrastructure to ensure, and this is a double edge, to ensure that what they were putting in the marketplace was clean material. The other is that what was being shipped in, they were prepared to handle. And there is a long list of pests and pathogens that have been introduced into Africa on food aid because you have to move it quickly. There's an economist, Charles Perrings, from Arizona, he dedicated his career to studying the impacts from invasive species. And he said once that a cargo container has a sampling of the organisms at every place it's been. And there's wisdom in that because that's, in fact, what we find. Hitchhikers on everything. We're moving organisms in wooden furniture. I have a couple slides I use of electric guitars manufactured in China. When they arrived at the port in Australia, there was a hole, and the assumption was it was a quality issue that they had drilled too many holes for the faceplate on this electric guitar. When they pulled the faceplate off, it was an exit hole. There were galleries, insect galleries, all throughout this wooden guitar. We're moving insects in everything. The same with pathogens and pests. It's just there are consequences to the global movement of people and goods. If you look at what we know about there are evolutionary consequences to this as well. If you look at how we studied evolution when I was going through the system, we learned about island biogeography, that if you had two islands separated by a certain distance, that the species would grow away from each other. It would evolve away from each other, and genetic differences would take. So we all know that. The Galapagos is a great place for having studied that. Okay, but those geographic boundaries now are irrelevant. We're putting plants and plant products on airplanes and flying them over mountains. We're putting plants and plant products on ships and transporting them across the seas. So the geographic boundaries that once kept organisms confined to certain areas are irrelevant. The consequences of that are we're finding that our concepts of taxonomic separation don't actually hold up. So an example being in the UK, they imported plants from South America. They ended up in a greenhouse, in a nursery, on a bench with local plants. Two different species that should not be able to interact actually hybridized and created a new species, a hybrid species. We would, if you do your pest risk assessment, that wouldn't have been one of the options. So these two things hybridized, and the scary part is the phenotype of the hybrid would not have been predictable based on the phenotype of the two parents. So how do you do a risk assessment? You can't. So that's just one example. There are others. So there are consequences to this global trade that we haven't fully grasped. We're making so much money, and it's solving so much problem. I don't think anybody wants to grapple with it right now. But the investment and the research necessary to deal with those problems is wildly inadequate. The investment in the infrastructure we need for early detection and surveillance is wildly inadequate for what we're doing.
So, I think, part of what I get out of what you're saying is that a lot of these issues are consequences of incentive structures that are not well aligned to they're aligned to certain groups, but not others, right? And, we tend to focus on, trying to find solutions through technology and, hard science when some of these might be, social science issues and that sort of stuff. So, you've laid out a whole bunch of areas that we need to think about. What do you think about as far as solutions?
Well, yeah, let me follow up first. I'll
Sure.
be happy to answer that. Let me follow up with something you said there about the social side. The social implications are staggering, and we already have examples of this. So if we look at the Arab Spring, we all remember the Arab Spring, okay, 2010, spread across North Africa into the Middle East, and we are still suffering the ramifications of that Arab Spring. So what was the cause of that? Well, there were many underlying cultural problems, social problems, and political problems, lots of those. But the proverbial last straw was the sudden increase in the price of wheat, that the government jacked up the price of wheat, sent the food vendor into the street, he self-immolates, and pretty soon you have massive protests in Tunisia that spread across the region. The proverbial last straw was food. Now fast forward, what's going on right now in the Mediterranean area, in Italy? In 2013, there was an outbreak of a disease in olives in southern Italy. It's called quick decline of olives, and it's caused by a bacterium. So it started to spread, and the government came in and does what phytosanitary agencies do. They slapped a quarantine on it, and then they decided to do an eradication zone. So they went in and started cutting down the trees. But this isn't like cutting down a field of corn. These trees are over 1,000
Really
years old. And these trees weren't just planted by the current generation. They've been in my family for 14 generations. This is a major issue. You had people climbing up in the trees and tying themselves to the trees to prevent the government from cutting them down. The local populations blame the scientists for bringing that in because they were studying this organism at the local experiment station. Now, ultimate genetic analyses proved it wasn't the same organism. The scientists weren't really responsible, but the scientists are actually facing charges and potential jail time for not reporting it in a timely manner. And so there were these massive social upheavals. This is present tense. This is still playing out. And social scientists are doing a really nice job of documenting. I give them a lot of kudos. They jumped right in and said, okay, how do we sort this out? And the problem is scientists don't talk to the public very well or very often. And we need to deal with that. But the social implications are massive. The Bangladesh story I told you earlier with the wheat blast pathogen. So the government came in and knowing the history in South America, they decided to eradicate. And the only way to eradicate was they burned the fields. The problem was a lot of the acreage in Bangladesh is farmed by people who don't own the land. So they grow the wheat to sell to the market to get the money to pay the lease on the land, and what's left buys the food for their family. Now the government comes in and burns all that. They have nothing, and it drives them deeper into poverty. The social implications of what I'm talking about are enormous. So I just want to toss that in based on your comment there. So.
Well, and that's just a really important thing to pay attention to. When we're talking about food security issues, right? It's not just sort of how many people are starving or how many people are hungry, right? Or in poor health due to not having sufficient nutrition, right? Sort of it's huge, as you just said, and sort of there's a lot of stories that I think are like this, right?
So there's the poverty hunger cycle. So people who are hungry become malnourished. They earn less in the market. There's lots of data on this. Mm-hmm. They earn less in the marketplace, and they drop into poverty. Those in poverty can't afford to buy enough food or the right kinds of food, become further malnourished, and that cycle just continues. So we need to alleviate poverty in order to eradicate hunger, but we need to eradicate hunger in order to alleviate poverty. So how do you break into that?
So do you think that these are things that where we know some, like, so you said we already know we already have technological solutions to increasing production, at least in some ways, and we'll find more, right?
Yeah.
Some of the social science on this seems to be pretty good too. I mean, sort of this is similar, on trade issues. If you just open up trade, it's going to hurt some people, right? And so, it might lower cost overall, right? But somebody who was producing the thing, right, is now not going to be able to compete, right? And sort of similarly, like you want to go and sort of for the population as a whole, or for the country as a whole, eradicate this disease, stop it, right, and stop a greater disaster, right? If you do that without dealing with the repercussions on this on the people who are growing that land, right, growing on that land, right, then there's just, a lot of damage that has now been done, right? So is this something that people just overlook in general when we jump in and do this, or is there something we don't understand about some of these repercussions?
So one of the challenges we have for all of these issues, the bottom line is the bottom line. And so it's about money. I think what we're seeing, and I don't know the number, but if you look at the number of countries that made that transition from poor and underdeveloped or lesser developed, whatever terminology you would like to use, into that middle tier of countries that are, becoming economically sound and players in the marketplace. If you look at those, almost without exception, the proportion of the population involved in agriculture plummets. And the viability of sustainability, or just lost the word I want to use, but people who live off the land plummets. That's not economically viable in the economic systems that are surviving, that are thriving. And so that's where we need social scientists integrated into these decisions we're making to help in the transition from a sustenance-based existence to having a place in the market. And that involves education again. It involves a different way of looking at the market. The United States, the biggest mistake we could make is believing none of this can happen here. That would be a horrific mistake.
None of what?
That we could have hunger, that we could have a declining public health. We're already seeing this in a couple cities.
Yeah, right.
And so, but we act as though that can't happen here. because we have such an advanced economy. It's only 100 years ago, and that's just 5 generations, where we had food riots in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it has happened here in the past. It can happen now. I think we're not paying attention to the things that are going to ultimately matter, in my opinion.
How do we pay more attention to these things, right? Is it policy issues? Do we need to get people in government that pay attention to these things, or at least know who to listen to, or what do you think? Right now, we've talked about these wicked problems, right? There's a lot of implications. There's a lot of potential for positive things, and there's a lot of potential for disaster, right? Right here, right now, where do we need to go? What do you think?
Yeah, so a lot again in that, but let me try to condense that. But right now, because, and I don't remember the exact number, so I'm going to throw a number. I don't remember what it is. 80% of the population in the United States lives within 15 miles of a grocery store that sells whatever you want 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So food's not on anyone's agenda. It's just not, because it's available. And so far, it's affordable by most people. Okay, so only
relatively, right? So most people, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Only a very small proportion of the population is actually impacted by the cost of food. We do have certain issues. There are exceptions to that. Food deserts.
Yeah, and I thought the numbers of people who are food insecure, even in like Manhattan, are pretty high. But yeah.
Well, so again, some of that goes to definition. What's food insecure?
Okay.
Is anybody starving in Manhattan? No. Do they have So what is food security? It's about access, and it's about affordability. Or access, it's available and affordable. And it's also about culturally relevant food. So not everybody eats everything. So there are a lot of things tied up in food security. But going back to what do we do, I think we need to address the things that could impact. So this issue of pests and pathogens, we're not going to kind of the only thing you need to know about trade rules is that trade rules. And if it gets down to a decision between taking a risk based on the health of a system versus the economics of the system, the decision almost always goes to the economics. So we will import things at a risk if it means a potential economic impact. It's just the way we do business. So if that's the way, we need to be overt about this. If that's the way we want to do business, let's put in place the systems that minimize the impacts of those decisions. I don't think those conversations we avoid having those conversations rather than having them and putting in place what we need to have to protect us. So I think some of this is just having the open discussions about identifying what the real issues are associated with the way we do business now.
So is detection sufficient? How much do you have to deal? Because a lot of this issue is sort of production, sort of in places where trade is occurring, in the infrastructure and policies, right? In places where they introduce greater risk to the people who are then or the places who are importing, right? The food or whatever it is that we're talking about, right? So do you think detection's enough, or sort of we have to somehow impact policies sort of everywhere, or what's your view on this?
So you look at we have simultaneously two issues being bantered about by FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization. One is further intensification, and they indicated 90% of the increased food that we need will come from further intensification of the lands that are already under cultivation. That's a big ask. At the same time, they're saying we need to move to low input sustainability. That's coming out of the same organization. Kind of ought to be talking. So I look at it, let's expand that out. We have a lot of academic institutions, government agencies, non-governmental organizations have bought into the concept that we need further intensification of existing agricultural systems. That's the agricultural community. If you go to the environmental community, they're publishing papers saying the worst thing that ever happened to the planet was intensified agriculture. perhaps we ought to put them in the same room at the same time and hash this out. The same is true with the invasive species and the biodiversity decline group. Now, they look at agriculture as causing species loss, as causing species decline. And they're recommending doing what we do for risk assessment. What do? We look at where an organism occurs and the environmental conditions that allow it to flourish at that location. And then we do climate matching around the planet. And Harrington probably talked about this, but you do climate matching around the planet and say, the same conditions exist here and here. So let's not move stuff from here to those locations, because if it gets introduced, it may flourish. So that's kind of how we do a pest risk assessment. Well, the environmental group is looking at it and using the same technology and saying, well, these species are threatened in this environment, so let's look around the planet and see where they would do well, and we'll move that whole community there. Well, that's kind of inconsistent in thinking, because that's creating the opportunity for them to become invasive. Because our ability to predict how organisms are going to behave in new environments is limited at best. And so again, these people ought to be in the same room at the same time. We go to meetings, we go to conferences that are theme-oriented. So the cross-fertilization of these ideas is not taking place at a level adequate to actually come up with the solutions you're looking for. In my opinion.
Yeah, on campus, as you know, the global food systems, you and I have had this conversation several times. What we're trying to do is figure out how to get people just within our little universe here at K-State into a room, get that diverse population. How do you do that? You mentioned earlier that you were doing presentations around the world on this. How do you tackle that huge problem of getting that sociology group with the agronomy group, with the plant pathology group, with the politicals? How do you do that?
Yeah, so it's like any other enterprise in the human sphere. It's about relationships. I think you have to seek out people, and trying to do that. Get a grant that would allow you to hold a workshop first, to bring people of different perspectives together and say, let's have a conversation. It has to be the right people, because not everybody can have these conversations without feeling threatened. So you have to put these people in the room and at least identify the issues in a clear manner that you can have a larger meeting on, and then get those perspectives aired in front of everyone, in front of the different perspectives, so that you can at least understand the opposing viewpoint on what you're doing. Until the understanding's there, you can't get to a point of identifying potential solutions. So I think the start is developing relationships across these disciplinary boundaries that we have.
I was going to say, does some of this, is that we as a society need to think more about how we instill values into, children, so that they grow up, being more willing to engage in these sorts of things, right? Because a lot of this is human issues and human relation issues and human values issues, as far as what incentivizes humans and that sort of. Some of it's evolutionarily driven, obviously. But do we need to be thinking about how the next generations should be approaching these things and talking to much younger people about this to solve them in the future?
So absolutely, yes, we need to do that. It's not enough. Sure. I think we need a lot more interaction between scientists and policymakers in a more meaningful way. So please let me clarify. Everything I said we need to do is going on at some level. So I didn't mean to imply in any sense that none of this is happening. This is all happening, but from my perspective, I have a sense of urgency about it right now. I think we are crossing into territory that is going to make it more difficult. No, that's wrong. Not more difficult. I think we're crossing into territory where the impacts are going to be greater. So, for example, that issue I brought up, do you believe in limits? at some point there are limits. And if we look at our ability to produce food, right now we can produce far more than we need. Okay, we know that based on loss estimates, which I think are overestimated, but even if they're half correct, we can produce far more food than is necessary to feed the current population. We can do that. But if we keep adding people without changing the way we're doing business, the surplus is going to narrow. So our margin for error narrows. Now when we have a prolonged drought in Australia that affects wheat exports, or a prolonged drought in the Ukraine that affects exports, both of which we have experienced in the previous 15 years, the impacts are going to be greater because there's just not enough to satisfy that demand. And then you look at the redistribution of pests and pathogens at increasing rates. So we have this tendency to think we should focus on catastrophes. So I will ask you this. We're worried about that avian influenza strain, the H5N1, that's going to come around, and that one strain of virus is going to take out 20% of the world's population. We worry about another SARS. We worry about FMD coming in because it alone, even though it as a disease, it's not going to do that, but as a market effect, it's going to devastate the cattle industry. We worry about those one organisms. So in some of the food security models that we play with, for a variety of reasons I won't go into, we've identified 30% displacement in the mean as catastrophic. So for any population, that would be catastrophic if there was a 30%. So the question I have is, what's the difference between a single organism causing a 30% displacement or 5 organisms each causing a 6% displacement? You still have 30% loss. That's what I see as changing right now because of the magnitude of change. And we know from a lot of experience that there's a delay from the time of introduction of these organisms to when they realize their full impacts. And China's seeing that right now in a big way. They opened up the doors in the 90s, and right now they're just stomping out fires from invasives. Well, that's going on globally. At some point, we have to pay for that decision, or in fact, lack of a decision. So I think we can do all of this. It's a matter of the timing. And I think what happens now as we go from the 7.3 or 4 billion that we're at now up to 10 billion, our margin for error shrinks because we're not going to be producing that much more food that we maintain the margin for error. I don't see that.
So I know you don't have all the solutions, and you're not saying that at all, right? But I know it's, on your view, not just food intensification and delivery, right? Sort of just production, right? And better delivery. So, what do you want to have happen? And I ask this because, I've heard you say education several times, right? And I'm in general skeptical about our ability just to sort of have information out there and sort of even talk to people and sort of have things improve. A lot of what you're talking about needs policy decisions that are, going to change the way we interact, right? Change, shift money or shift resources to places that need their infrastructure improved, right? To sort of make them better able to handle the invasives coming in, or less likely to send them out, and these kinds of things, right? So this isn't just sort of if we let the dollar determine where we're going to buy our produce from, nothing's going to change, right? We run all these risks. So like, how do we, just in general, like what are you looking for to kind of come up on top, right? To sort of start to address these issues, besides just like us sitting here and our dollar is going to determine where we're buying our produce from, and then we'll have some detection mechanisms, right? So what do you want overall, like the picture to look like?
Yeah, to go to that education issue, to me, it's not about providing information.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's about building the educational infrastructure in these countries to self-educate.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. This is super important.
That's a big distinction
right?
between just providing information. Mm-hmm. Because when you do that, when they educate themselves, their solutions will be centric so that the solutions won't be imposed by some world organization or by another country that's providing them aid, which we do. If you look at what's going on in Africa with respect to investment from China, Africa is got a lot of issues right now. So because some of those countries have been so poor for so long, they don't have as many options as we do. So for example, agreeing to allow another country to fund a port in their country that allows them to tie into the global marketplace, so that's a good thing, but in exchange for land. So you look at Saudi Arabia, you look at South Korea, you look at several countries are buying land in Africa, China, big time, lots of land, keeping it in agriculture, but to export to their country. That's China's food security strategy, is have Africa produce the food. Now you could argue that, well, Africa's going to get paid for that food. And with that money, they'll buy the food they need. But if we look at that strategy, it hasn't worked so far for everyone. And so I think there are challenges to that model. And if there's a political difference, I mean, just look at what's going on now with respect to tariffs. There was a political disagreement between the United States and Mexico. And we said, we're going to impose tariffs on what's coming in. That would affect the price of food in a big way. So I think you're never fully secure. And most people look at countries in Africa and Southern Asia as that's where the food security problem is. But Japan's not food secure with respect to food production. They buy a lot of their food. Their population's much greater than what they produce. And that's true of multiple countries, that they have the financial means to buy food. So with the current model of letting the global marketplace solve food security, what that means is you have to have enough resource to buy that food. And almost without exception, commodity independent, it goes to the person who pays the most. So your poor stay poor and food insecure, while you're rich get the food and the increasing economic well-being. So I don't think this global distribution system is a long-term solution for the planet. I just don't see it. And let's think, what are the consequences of global marketplace? We've talked about challenges of climate change, of water, of these things. When you move food, it takes energy. So the more food movement, because we're going to add 28% more people to the planet, that means moving more and more food. That takes more and more energy to do that. And when you move food, you move water. So even our grains that are somewhere between 9 and 14% moisture, when you're talking about millions of metric tons, you're moving water from one location to you're taking it out of some of these places. But now imagine tomatoes that are 80% water. Most of what you're moving is water. So the two problems that we really need to get our hands around, water and energy, are exacerbated by this model for food security.
Yeah, along with the various nutrients and things like that that are, at least at this point, considered non-renewable and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So, I mean,
again,
yeah.
We're going to solve all these
Okay.
issues. It's the time frame that I'm really trying to draw attention to. We're going to fix all of this.
So I'm
will.
way more skeptical about than
Yeah,
you
I was
are
gonna
on
say,
this,
do you
'cause
think-
sort of-
you think
because
we
how,
are?
How do we
Yeah,
solve
absolutely.
these things, right?
Yeah,
Sort of
because
because
if you just look back through history, there are times when challenges look insurmountable. But it's a question of how long are we willing to wait until we do what needs to be done. And our history is we're willing to wait pretty long. We have to be dragged kicking and screaming into meaningful change. But we always get there. And it was Winston Churchill who said, he loved Americans because they always did the right thing after they tried every other alternative. So it's, change is hard. Some of these things are hard because people benefit by one direction or another. And so you're pitting who's going to benefit most by making any management decision or any policy change. So, right now, the World Trade Organization is completely on board with trade as a solution to the economy. There's not a single country that I can think of that hasn't identified increased exports as a solution to their economic woes. Everybody says that. Well, there are consequences to that. And there's a limit to how many of the problems that actually can solve without creating new problems. What I tell my students is every generation solves a few problems and creates a few more. And these are the ones we're leaving to the next generation. So we will solve these. It's just a matter of the sense of urgency that's appropriate to the magnitude of the problem. And we don't all see that the same way.
Right. So I guess one of the main issues here, though, and you've highlighted very, very well how much the issues are about, international cooperation, right? And recognition of how interconnected so many of the issues are, right? But the solutions are going to have to be along the lines of, if we want to solve the food security issues and we want to sort of address our own biosecurity here, like in the U.S., we have to think about investing more in other countries, right? Sort of their basic infrastructure, in their education, right? And sort of, this seems like, right, and maybe in their agricultural systems and sort of a whole variety. This seems like the kind of thing that would, begin to start to address what you're talking about. But then we have to figure out like how and who and, what way, and are we really willing to do this? And do we really see this? Coordination problems are really, really hard, right? Sort of like from our own point of view, it's really hard to see the long-term implications of sort of a certain way of doing things that are, right, where we're given how the system works now, right? It's in our own best interest to do something else.
Yeah, I agree. So really good point. And Maureen and I have actually had several conversations about this. There are issues of scale involved here. And I'm not a fan, it might have been clear in some of my comments, I'm not a fan of top-down. I do not believe there's a solution to global food security or insecurity. That doesn't even make sense to me because the problem's not the same everywhere. The limitations are not the same everywhere. And this is why I was saying before, we need to build the educational and public health infrastructure locally. And what Maureen and I have talked about is, perhaps what we need to do is get teams of people involved, scientists of different disciplines, both the social and the hard science side, and look at an area. So whether that's a village or a region or what, but identify an area and say, let's improve the quality of life in this area. What's missing? What do we need to do? What do they need to do? Help them build the systems they need to improve their quality of life. Food security, public health, education, those types of systems. We can do that. And then you replicate that until it doesn't work. And then you find out why it doesn't work here, and you create the solutions for that location. If enough of us do that, we can address all these things because to me, it's a series of local problems. It's not a global problem.
And do you think it's a series of local scientific problems, like problems that science can address, or is because, you said social science too, but we know a lot of, what is needed, right? And but worse, actually, there's a tension between sort of what's going to be good for, one group of people and what's going to be good for another group of people looking at that group of people, right?
Yeah. So it's not just about science. To me, science is not the limiting part about this. Policy is. Policy, okay, here's how I describe it. Maybe this was the image you were talking about. So I describe it that if you want to be successful, you need to make good decisions. And in order to make good decisions, you need information. And what controls the flow through that process is certainly on the beginning part about that, from information to decisions, is experience. Experience allows you to sort out relevant from irrelevant information. It allows you to look at past decisions to know which ones were successful and which ones weren't. So the beginning part of that, from information to decisions, is largely influenced by experience. Well, we're rich in experience of hunger. We've got millennia of experience in hunger. and famines. But when we look at the second half of that equation, from decisions to success, what guides that part is policy, because policy provides the framework for decision making. So it steers your decisions in a certain direction. So if you don't have the policy right, you don't end up where you want to end up. So we need to put more thought into the policy, and we haven't been successful in doing that. And I think some of that goes back to the thinking that we have a global problem. We don't have a global problem. We have a network of problems that don't have the same issues involved. So we need to change how we look at this hunger problem, this food security problem. It's not the same everywhere. It's not, the water issue is not the same everywhere. The land availability issue is not the same everywhere. None of these things, the corruption in government, the wars, the history of any given country, they're not the same. And it will, all you have to do is look at Europe. We have the European Union, but yet they struggle at times to make progress in a given area. And it's not for lack of desire. It's because we're talking about different countries. We're not talking about different states of the same country. We're talking about different countries that have different institutional cultures. They have different cultures. They have different languages oftentimes. They don't have the same bureaucratic structure. So the agencies that are tasked with doing different things are not even the same. So it becomes more difficult to look at this as an aggregate problem instead of an individual problem.
Is part of some of the issue that some of the people that need to put in resources, whether that be money would be one of them, are not the people who are experiencing the problem, and there needs to be more sacrifice on the parts of some people to as inputs to help these other groups to get going, right? It's sort of like it's not my backyard, but like if you want to help the food security of another country or another part of even the United States, that's going to take a sacrifice in resources from somebody else in the United States to do that, right? And is there not necessarily the will there to do it in some cases?
Yeah. So if I understood your point, I think this goes to that scale issue. And the scale's not even going to be the same in different places. Sometimes it's going to be very local. Sometimes it'll be regional. And so the ability to cooperate is absolutely critical. And that'll be defined by their history. And you only have to look at different regions of the world where conflict has been going on for 1,000 years to know that that's easier said than done to solve. So scale becomes an important issue in this. And again, that's why I'm kind of going to, it's not a single issue. And if you want to make real progress, we have to kind of back off from that. And, there's the old adage, this is when you can tell how old I'm getting, you kind of remember these things, but, teach someone or give someone a fish, you feed them for a day. Teach them how to fish, you feed them for life. I think we need to incorporate that thinking into how we're approaching this problem. I don't think the solution is let's figure out a way to ship them enough food. I don't like that as the solution because it exacerbates so many other issues.
I mean, I don't think so either. But what I'm just saying is that there needs to be resources for somebody to do the teaching, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And that's not always the case.
You know what? We can find it. Yeah. Just look at the impact
Hopefully.
Bill and Melinda Gates are having. That's real impact, what they're doing. It's impressive that they've dedicated their lives now and their resources to making real change for folks. It can be done. And there are probably many people like them, maybe not with as much resource, but we need to kind of reorient the thinking of some of our government agencies that do these things to look at the world a little bit differently.
Yeah, and so I think it's super important to recognize that I very much you say it's not one problem, right? So there's not a single issue. There's a whole bunch of different issues. I think that's great, and we need to recognize that. And I probably have there's a lot more we could probably talk about, of course, right, about sort of what that might look like down the end. But the main thing that I think that I want to take away from right here from what you're saying is the shift to paying attention to these issues, not so much what the policies are going to look like, right, or sort of whether we can actually do it, right, but just sort of look the global food security issue, right, and how we make the planet sustainable for, however many billion people it will be at whatever, point is an issue, very much not just in production and distribution, right? Sort of, there's no way we address that problem without hitting all sorts of policy, all sorts of economic, all sorts of education, all sorts of infrastructure issues, right? So you've been going around talking to, different people. How successful have you been in sort of convincing people to be paying more attention to this?
Well, as you might imagine, I get mixed reaction. It takes time to influence someone's thinking. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with people identifying where I need to fix my thinking. I don't pretend to have this all sorted out. All I'm trying to do is get a discussion going in an area which I think is deficient in enough thinking. So, no one person's going to have this sorted out. But I believe that the more thinking that we do and the more exchanging of thinking, the better chance we have of getting to a better place. And so look at what are our options, okay? Let's just keep pushing this envelope. Let it go. And we can support 25 billion people on the planet. The consequence is that we're going to nourish them through manufactured protein tablets, synthetic food. Well, we could do that. Is that really a desirable outcome? No, I like fresh food. I don't want to end up, I wouldn't wish that on my children and grandchildren. Just wouldn't do that. So we have some decisions to make about what we think is a good vision for the world of the future. And the decisions we make now will affect that.
And the critical importance of bringing diverse groups together, I think,
absolutely
is the central portion of what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Jim, we want to be respectful of your time. This has been a really great conversation. Do you have anything else you'd like to say? Or Scott, Maureen, do you have any further questions?
Well, thank you for not laughing or throwing anything.
No, I think you make a really good point. It's the point of this podcast is to have discussions like this, and I hope anybody out there that's listening, has appreciated kicking around some of these ideas. We don't have necessarily all of the right answers, but the only way we're going to get to them is through discussion and collaboration and that sort of thing, right? So,
lots of room for contribution to this. Lots of room.
Clearly.
Young people out there starting their careers, you have a bright future ahead, right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Jim. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, drop us an email or check out our website at kstate.edu/research/global food. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.